Genghis Khan, hero or villain? 2 episodes ago, we watched a 9-year-old boy get abandoned on the frozen Mongolian steppe with no food, no tribe, and no future. We watched him get enslaved, humiliated, and hunted. And we watched him survive every single thing the world threw at him until the day he stood on the banks of the Onon River, and the entire Mongolian world knelt before him. Last episode, we watched that same man unleash something on the world that historians are still trying to find the right words for. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years reduced to rubble in days. Populations wiped out on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. An empire built on a foundation of bones. So now we ask the question we've been building toward since the very beginning. Was Genghis Khan a hero or a villain? And I want to be honest with you before we even start. This is not going to be a video that ends with a clean answer, because there isn't one. Anyone who tells you Genghis Khan was simply a monster doesn't know the full story. And anyone who tells you he was simply a liberator and a visionary has clearly never read about what happened to Samarkand. What this video is going to do is give you every piece of the puzzle, every argument from every side, every number, every fact, every perspective, and then you are going to decide. Because that's what history actually is. It's not a verdict. It's a conversation. And this particular conversation has been going on for 800 years. Let's get into it. Part 1. The case against him. The numbers. Let's start with the hardest part. Let's start with the dead. Historians estimate that the Mongol conquests under Genghis Khan and his immediate successors killed somewhere between 40 and 60 million people. Some estimates go even higher. Let's sit with that number for a second. 40 to 60 million people. In the 13th century, the total population of the entire world was somewhere around 400 million. That means the Mongol conquests may have wiped out somewhere between 10 and 15% of every living human being on the planet. To put that in modern terms, that would be the equivalent of killing over 1 billion people today. More than the entire population of Africa. More than the entire population of Europe and North America combined. These are not battlefield casualties. These are not just soldiers who died in combat. The vast majority of these deaths are civilians, farmers whose crops were burned, city dwellers who were slaughtered after their walls were breached, populations that starved because the Mongols destroyed the irrigation systems that fed entire regions, people who died from the plague and famine that followed in the wake of the campaigns. In northeastern Iran, in the region of Khorasan, historians estimate the population dropped by as much as 90% following the Mongol invasion. Cities like Nishapur, Merv, and Herat, which had populations of hundreds of thousands, were essentially emptied. Merv, which may have been one of the largest cities in the world at the time, was reportedly home to over 1 million people before the Mongols arrived. Contemporary sources claim that after the massacre, a monk who came to bury the dead counted 1.3 million corpses. Modern historians debate the exact figures, but they agree the destruction was total. Iraq lost so much of its population during the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258, technically under Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, but using the empire and army Genghis built, that it took the country 600 years to recover its pre-invasion population levels. 600 years. We are talking about civilizational collapse, not a military defeat, not a change of government, the actual end of a civilization that had been continuously developing for thousands of years. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had been the center of Islamic science, philosophy, medicine, and art for 5 centuries, was destroyed in a single week. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, one of the greatest libraries ever assembled in human history, was burned. Scholars say the Tigris River ran black with ink from the books and manuscripts thrown into it. The accumulated knowledge of centuries, gone. And here is the thing about knowledge. You can rebuild a city. Walls go back up. Markets reopen. But when you kill the scholars, when you burn the libraries, when you destroy the intellectual infrastructure of a civilization, that knowledge is gone forever. We will never know what was in those books. We will never know what scientific discoveries were lost. We will never know how much further ahead humanity might have been if the House of Wisdom had survived. The environmental damage alone is staggering. The Mongols didn't just kill people, they destroyed the systems that kept people alive. Across Central Asia and the Middle East, they wrecked irrigation networks that had been built and maintained over thousands of years. Without those systems, farmland turned to desert. It was not just the people of that generation who suffered. It was every generation that came after them. Regions that were once fertile breadbaskets are still desert today. The Mongol invasions may have contributed to permanent climate and ecological shifts in parts of Central Asia. Now add to all of this the specific brutality of how the Mongols fought. This was not clean warfare, if such a thing even exists. The deliberate massacre of civilian populations was policy. It was strategy. The terror was intentional. Genghis Khan understood that if word spread that cities who resisted were utterly destroyed, future cities would surrender without a fight. And it worked. But that means every atrocity, every massacre, every city burned to the ground was a calculated choice, not a side effect of war. A tool of war, the pyramids of skulls outside conquered cities, the rivers rerouted to wash away the bodies, the deliberate targeting of the educated classes, the doctors, the engineers, the scholars, the administrators, to cripple any future resistance. These are not the actions of a man who simply got caught up in the chaos of battle. These are the actions of a man who thought carefully about how to maximize destruction and implemented it systematically. So that is the case against him. And it is a devastating case. Tens of millions dead, civilizations erased, knowledge lost forever, ecological damage that lasted centuries, deliberate, systematic industrial-scale brutality deployed as a conscious strategy. If you stopped the video right here, the verdict would be clear. But we are not stopping here. He was born into, before we build the case for Genghis Khan, we need to talk about something that often gets left out of this conversation. Context, not as an excuse. Context is never an excuse for mass murder. But context is essential for understanding, and understanding is what we're here for. The world of the 13th century is not the world of today. There is no Geneva Convention. There is no international law. There is no concept of war crimes or crimes against humanity. Every major empire in this era, the Chinese dynasties, the Islamic caliphates, the European kingdoms, the Byzantine Empire, wages war with a brutality that would horrify a modern observer. The practice of massacring the population of a conquered city was not invented by Genghis Khan. It was standard military doctrine going back thousands of years. The Romans did it. The Assyrians did it. The Crusaders did it. The Chinese dynasties did it to each other. You conquered a city that resisted, and you made an example of it so that the next city would surrender without a fight. This logic was universal. What was different about Genghis Khan was not the practice. It was the scale. Because no one before him had the organizational capacity to do it across an entire continent. But here is the other thing about context. The world Genghis Khan was born into was already a world of constant, grinding violence. The Mongolian steppe was not peaceful before he arrived. Tribes had been raiding, enslaving, and killing each other for generations. The Jin dynasty in China had been deliberately funding raids on Mongol territory to keep them weak and divided. The Tatars, who poisoned his father, were themselves a tool of the Jin Empire's policy of keeping the steppe fragmented. Genghis Khan did not create a culture of violence. He was produced by one. He was abandoned, enslaved, and hunted before he was a teenager. Every lesson the world taught him was that strength meant survival, and weakness meant death. You can argue about whether he had to respond the way he did, but you cannot pretend he invented the world he lived in. Part 3. The case for him, what he actually built. Now let's talk about what is genuinely, undeniably remarkable about this man. Because there is a real case to be made here, and it deserves to be made seriously. Start with the unification of the Mongolian steppe. Before Genghis Khan, this region had never been unified. Not once, in all of recorded history. Dozens of tribes in permanent conflict, with no shared law, no shared identity, no shared anything. He brought them together, not just by force, but by creating something new. A Mongolian identity. A sense that they were one people with one purpose. He did this through a combination of military genius, political intelligence, and genuine ideological innovation. He banned the kidnapping of women, one of the primary causes of tribal warfare. He outlawed the enslavement of Mongols by other Mongols. He created a law code called the Yasa, which established rules that applied to everyone equally regardless of tribal background. He built a postal system called the Yam, a network of relay stations stretching across the entire empire that allowed messages and goods to travel thousands of miles in days. This was the internet of the 13th century. Let's go through the specific arguments that come up every time this debate happens. And let's take each one seriously. Argument 1. He spread death on an unprecedented scale. Therefore, he is a villain. The counter-argument is that scale alone cannot be the determining factor. Otherwise, every major historical figure who ever led a war is a villain by definition. Alexander the Great killed hundreds of thousands. The Roman Empire killed millions over centuries of conquest. The Crusades killed hundreds of thousands. Every European colonial empire killed millions. If the body count alone makes someone a villain, then virtually every conqueror and empire builder in history joins Genghis Khan in that category. Which might be the correct conclusion, but it's a conclusion that needs to be applied consistently, and it rarely is. Argument 2. He deliberately targeted civilians, which makes him uniquely evil. This is a stronger argument because it goes beyond scale to method. The systematic massacre of civilian populations, the deliberate destruction of agricultural and irrigation infrastructure, the targeting of scholars and skilled workers, these are not just side effects of war. They are policies. The counter-argument here is complicated. Genghis Khan did offer mercy to cities that surrendered. The massacres were not random. They were triggered by resistance. The same logic was used by virtually every military force in history, including modern ones. Make resistance so costly that the enemy chooses surrender. This does not make it right, but it places it in a context of military doctrine rather than pure sadism. What is harder to defend is the sheer totality of the destruction. Even by the standards of his era, the erasure of entire civilizations goes beyond strategic deterrence into something that looks more like a desire to eliminate rather than conquer. Argument 3. His legal reforms and meritocracy were genuinely progressive. This argument holds up well under scrutiny. The Yasa, the religious tolerance, the meritocratic promotion system, these were genuinely ahead of their time. The argument that he was more enlightened than his contemporaries in certain specific ways is historically defensible. The counter-argument is that these reforms primarily benefited Mongols and people willing to submit to Mongol rule. The same man who guaranteed religious freedom within his empire was actively destroying entire religious civilizations beyond its borders. The tolerance was real, but it had a very specific boundary, the boundary of submission. Submit and you get the benefits of Mongol law. Resist and the tolerance disappears completely. Argument 4. He was a product of his time and cannot be judged by modern standards. This is the argument historians use most often, and it is also the most frustrating one. It is true that judging historical figures by contemporary moral standards is anachronistic and intellectually sloppy. Genghis Khan did not have access to modern concepts of human rights, international law, or the moral frameworks we use today. But this argument can be taken too far. The people who were massacred at Samarkand and Merv and Baghdad did not experience their deaths as a product of their time. They experienced them as the end of everything. The mothers who watched their children killed did not find comfort in historical relativism. At some point, the sheer scale of human suffering has to be acknowledged as something more than a cultural artifact. Argument 5. His empire created the conditions for the Renaissance and modern globalization. This is perhaps the most interesting argument and also the most uncomfortable one. Because it may be true. The Pax Mongolica genuinely did facilitate an unprecedented exchange of ideas and technologies between civilizations. The trade routes, the diplomatic networks, the movement of scholars and craftsmen across the empire. These had real and lasting positive effects on human civilization. But this argument asks us to weigh the deaths of tens of millions of actual people against hypothetical, future benefits to other people who weren't born yet. That is a morally treacherous calculation. History is full of atrocities that someone later argued were necessary for progress. That argument has been used to justify slavery, colonialism, and genocide. We should be very careful about accepting it, even when the historical connections are real. Part 5. What historians actually say. Let's bring in some actual scholarly perspectives. Because this debate has been going on in academic circles for decades, and it's worth knowing where serious historians land. Jack Weatherford, whose book Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World is probably the most widely read modern biography, argues strongly for a positive reinterpretation of Genghis Khan's legacy. Weatherford emphasizes the religious tolerance, the meritocracy, the legal innovations, and the role of the Mongol Empire in connecting civilizations. He argues that the negative image of Genghis Khan is largely a product of biased sources. The people who wrote about the Mongols were the people the Mongols defeated, and you don't get balanced accounts from people whose cities just got burned down. This is a fair point. Almost everything we know about the Mongol conquest comes from Persian, Chinese, and Arab sources, written by people who had every reason to portray the Mongols in the worst possible light. The Mongols themselves left very few written records. We are reading the history of the conquered, not the conquerors. On the other side, historians like David Morgan and Timothy May, while acknowledging the genuine achievements of the Mongol Empire, are far less willing to minimize the destruction. Morgan in particular argues that the collapse of the Abbasid Caliphate and the destruction of Central Asian civilization represents one of the greatest cultural catastrophes in human history, and that no amount of trade route improvement changes that fundamental fact. Peter Frankopan, in his book The Silk Roads, takes a more nuanced position, arguing that the Mongol conquests were both genuinely catastrophic and genuinely transformative, and that the two things cannot be separated. The same event that destroyed Baghdad created the conditions for the Renaissance. Both things are true simultaneously, and that is where most serious historians actually land. Not on one side or the other, but in the uncomfortable middle, where great achievements and great atrocities exist in the same story, carried out by the same hands. Part 6. The personal Genghis Khan. We've talked a lot about policy and numbers and historical impact. But let's talk about the man himself for a moment, because there are details about Genghis Khan as a person that complicate any simple verdict. He was, by all accounts, a man of genuine personal loyalty. He never forgot the people who helped him when he had nothing, the family that helped him escape after his first capture. He remembered them and rewarded them decades later when he was emperor. Burda, his first wife, he loved her genuinely and consistently in a world where that was not required of him at all. When she was abducted, he went to war to get her back. When she gave birth to Jochi under circumstances that cast doubt on the child's paternity, he publicly claimed Jochi as his son and treated him as his heir. That decision cost him politically. He made it anyway. He was also a man who valued knowledge in a genuine way. After every conquest, he sought out scholars, engineers, doctors, and administrators from defeated civilizations and brought them into his service. Not just as slaves, as valued experts. He was genuinely curious about other cultures, other religions, other ways of organizing the world. He held philosophical debates at his court between representatives of different faiths. He asked questions. He listened. For a man with absolute power, that intellectual curiosity is remarkable. He was generous to his soldiers and his followers in a way that was genuinely unusual for a ruler of his era. The loot of conquered civilizations was distributed down through the ranks rather than hoarded at the top. Men who fought for him knew they would share in the rewards. That is part of why they followed him so completely and so far from home. And yet, this same man ordered the massacre of entire cities. This same man reportedly had the Tatar males measured against a wagon wheel axle and had everyone above the line executed. This same man created a deliberate policy of terror that he implemented systematically across an entire continent. How do you hold those two things in your head at the same time? A man who was personally loyal and generous, who valued knowledge and tolerated difference, who built something genuinely impressive and lasting, and who was also responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people. The honest answer is that you don't resolve it. You hold both things, because that is what he was. Let's talk about what Genghis Khan actually left behind 800 years later. The obvious legacy is genetic. Studies suggest that roughly 16 million men alive today are direct patrilineal descendants of Genghis Khan, carrying his Y chromosome. That is about 0.5% of all men on Earth. The reason for this is partly his many children, and partly the deliberate policy of his armies in conquered territories. It is, depending on your perspective, either a remarkable biological legacy or a reminder of systematic sexual violence on an enormous scale. Both things are true. In Mongolia today, Genghis Khan is a national hero. His face is on the currency. The international airport in Ulaanbaatar is named after him. Statues of him are everywhere. He is the founding father of the Mongolian nation, the man who took a collection of warring tribes and gave them an identity and a place in history. To Mongolians, he is not a monster. He is the greatest man who ever lived. In Iran, Iraq, Central Asia, the regions most devastated by the conquests, the view is very different. The Mongol invasions are remembered as a civilizational catastrophe, the moment when the Islamic Golden Age was ended by fire and sword. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258 is still mourned as one of the greatest tragedies in Islamic history. In China, the view is complicated. The Mongols conquered China, but they also became Chinese. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, founded the Yuan dynasty and in many ways became a Chinese emperor. The relationship between Mongol and Chinese identity is complex and politically sensitive in ways that continue to play out today. In the West, Genghis Khan has been through multiple cycles of reputation. In the 19th century, he was mostly seen as a symbol of barbaric Eastern destruction, the savage from the steppe who burned civilization. In the late 20th and early 21st century, a wave of revisionist histories pushed back against this, emphasizing the positive aspects of the Mongol Empire. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the space between the caricatures. After everything, after the numbers and the arguments and the history and the personal details and the scholarly debate, was Genghis Khan a hero or a villain? Here is what I know for certain. He was the most consequential individual human being who ever lived, in terms of direct impact on the world. No one person in history changed more of the map, affected more lives, ended more civilizations, and simultaneously created more connections between surviving ones. For better or worse, and it was absolutely both. He shaped the world we live in today in ways that are still unfolding. I know that the destruction he caused was real, was staggering, was deliberate, and cannot be minimized or explained away. I know that the things he built, the legal code, the meritocracy, the religious tolerance, the trade networks, were real, were remarkable for their time, and had genuine positive effects on millions of people. I know that the people who call him simply a monster are ignoring half the story. And I know that the people who call him simply a visionary are ignoring the other half. I know that history does not produce clean verdicts on complex people. And I know that a man who changes the world as completely as Genghis Khan did is never going to be simple. But here is the question I want to leave you with. Not the answer. The question. When we weigh a historical figure, what actually matters? Is it intention, what they were trying to do? Is it outcome, what they actually achieved? Is it the ratio of good to harm? Is it whether the good could have been achieved without the harm? Is it whether the people who suffered would have suffered anyway under someone else? Is it whether the positive legacy was worth the cost? Because depending on which of those questions you decide matters most, you will reach a different verdict on Genghis Khan, and on Napoleon, and on Caesar, and on every other figure who ever built something great on a foundation of violence. That is not a comfortable place to end, but it is an honest one. History is not a courtroom. Genghis Khan is not going to be sentenced. The dead are already dead. The cities are already dust. What we can do, the only thing we can do, is look at the whole story, hold all of it at once, and decide for ourselves what it means. So, hero or villain? You tell me. Drop your verdict in the comments. I want to know where you land, and I want to know why. The best arguments, on both sides, I'll read in a future video. If you've watched all 3 episodes of this series, thank you. Genuinely. This has been the most ambitious thing I've put on this channel, and your support made it worth doing. Episode 1 and 2 are linked in the description if you want to go back to the beginning. Next in the series, we are moving on to the next conqueror. A different era, a different continent, the same fundamental question. Subscribe so you're there from the start. I'll see you in the next one.